Welcome to Behind the Creation, where I interview founding members, founding organizers, and also core contributors within the crypto space to kind of learn more about their personal background and also learn more about them as an individual. Today on this interview, we have Miko Matsumura. Miko, welcome to the show.
Great. Nice to be here.
Thanks for taking out the time and being here with us to kind of, allow us to learn a little bit more about you and kind of like who you are within the space and then also what you do. But the most important thing with that is how you came to, how you became where you are today. So whether it's going to be from childhood, growing memories, and all the way to now to see who you are as a person. And
Sounds great.
to kind of kick it off, we want to go to the beginning roots of Miko and kind of like talk a little bit about childhood and kind of like how it was for you growing up.
Absolutely. So going back to my roots, it's super interesting because I feel like my dad's side of the family, my dad is a science person and a professor, right? And in a way, my mom and dad are from Japan. I grew up actually in Wisconsin and then we moved to Michigan. So like in the Midwestern United States. I may talk a little bit more about that, but really there weren't lots of Asians there. So very much kind of grew up as a sort of a separate type of person. I think one of the things that did for me in terms of like superpowers today is what I realized is that one of the things that happens when people give talks in public is that they actually fear being separated from the herd, right? So a lot of people who give talks are kind of fearful. And I to me, like one of the things that happened as a result of being kind of separated from my herd at an early age is just that I don't really fear being singled out. So in a sense, like I'm very comfortable on stage because, I think the only thing that I'm uncomfortable with is the sort of natural feeling that the time that you're using of everyone is non-refundable, right? So to me, I feel nervous about that, but I don't feel nervous about myself. Like I don't feel like, oh, I'm unsafe or oh, I'm scared. Like no, I'm scared to waste the audience's time. That's what I'm scared of. And to me, that's a good, okay thing to be scared of, right? Like if you're scared of that, you're just a good person, right? Like if you're not scared of wasting the audience's time and you're only scared about your own social status, you're only scared about your own like ego, then like that's not an awesome place from which to speak. So, I would say that's a connection from my childhood, growing up kind of really different. But I would say another big one is that my dad came from a really kind of an ambitious upbringing. Like, in Japan, basically his mom took him to the gates of Tokyo University with his brothers, the best university in Japan, and basically she told her sons, including my dad, who was the middle child, said, "You're going to go to school here," right? Which is sort of like an amazing thing. Actually, my dad's older brother went, my dad went, and actually the younger brother did not go, right? So in a sense, like, and he regretted that, so it really was tough on the younger brother, but like in a sense that characterizes sort of a little bit of the kind of family that I grew up in, which is my dad pressured us. I did undergrad at University of Michigan, which was the local state school. My brother went to MIT undergrad. He actually ended up doing UC Berkeley grad and got his PhD, which is what I was supposed to do. And I went to Yale grad and I actually did not get my PhD, which I was not supposed to do. That probably was one of the hardest things in my life, actually, in my young life, was not getting a PhD.
It was kind of like your mom already knew the expectations. She's like, "You guys are going here, by the way. You guys aren't going to anywhere else." I mean, your grandmother to your guys.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. That's right. The expectations are very high, right? So I
Mhm.
definitely feel like that's part of an experience that I think might be familiar for people who grew up with Asian parents, right? Because obviously the idea of this sort of like academic and very educational focused and very sort of like, and I think because of things like the Confucian philosophy, which also strangely applies also to South Asia, which is non-Confucian, there's still a more kind of a parental authority, right? There's a more appeal. So that applied to me as well, which is, Japan is a bit of a paternalistic society. and it's a little more kind of central authoritarian, probably as a function of Confucius. So, I think that's part of my values and upbringing as well.
Now for that one, so the values got passed down to your dad, and your dad kind of like instilled the same values into you as well. Now, did he also pressure you to kind of like, hey, you have to go through this way, you have to go through a certain route?
For
Uh,
sure. For sure. So in my family, the correct route was to get a PhD and to be basically a professor or academic. Right? That was the correct thing to do. And in a sense, I would say the roots of my sort of fervor around things like decentralization kind of come from escaping, like in a sense, like where when I left graduate school, I definitely had this kind of terror, right? Because I was stepping off of the path of prescribed safety, and I wasn't doing the best thing to do, right? So in a sense, my dad freaked out, and like, because I was not doing what I was supposed to do. And I think when your dad freaks out and you're living under kind of a more Confucian system, like you freak out, right? Because your dad is sort of your protector, and it's the person who's supposed to make sure that you turn out okay, right? So, for me, like in a sense, it was kind of like what's amazing about the story of East and West, right, is that the story of the West is inherently sort of oppositional. Like if you go back to the roots of like Western psychology, there's the kind of the Oedipus complex, right, where Oedipus kind of killed his father, right? So this gets into like Jungian archetypes, like Carl Gustav Jung kind of modeled this whole idea that kind of made its way into the hero's journey, right? So if you look at like Star Wars, right, Luke Skywalker's dad is Darth Vader, right, and they get in a lightsaber fight, right? So in a sense, like this idea of like killing off your father and the Oedipus complex is sort of a deeply rooted psychology within the West, right? But in the East, it's not the same. Like in the East, it's more the young are respectful of authority, they bow to authority, right? So in a sense, like the part of me, but the thing that was amazing about our family's journey is that my father himself was rebellious and in a way embodied the American spirit more than the Japanese spirit. So in a sense, like I think his sort of sense of rebellion actually caused him to leave Japan, and he basically kind of came to the US, and he literally had like, this is kind of going to sound super cheesy, but he literally had $10 in his pocket, and the thing that was crazy was that there was some kind of fee where he had to pay $5, and so he ended up having only five, when he got here. So like, actually, he was in Canada at the time, but eventually, kind of like made his way, made his fortune. So I think to me, like that kind of entrepreneurial spirit is probably deeply burning within me in the form of almost like the immigrant journey, right? Because obviously, the thing that happens with immigration, one thing that people don't underline that much is that in the US, there's a dream, the American dream, and there's this kind of idea of someone who's seeking opportunity. But I think the other thing that's true about the mirror image of entrepreneurship is that immigrants are dissatisfied, right? Because I think when you leave a place, it's largely because you're dissatisfied with the place, not because you're excited about a new place. Because when you leave a place, you don't actually know, the place you're in, you don't know the new place. So why would you go to a new place that you don't know, right? Most immigrants aren't doing that. Most immigrants are actually leaving a place that they do know because it's uncomfortable there, And I
Mhm.
think that kind of discomfort is a really big kind of hallmark of entrepreneurship, right? Like, there's these tremendous questions. I like the questions you're asking because they really speak to purpose and motivation and character, right? Like, who is this person? Why are they doing what they do? And, I think those are great. Those are the biggest questions for me in venture capital.
Yeah, because for like a lot of people too, it's kind of like I love to play poker, by the way. So for me, it's like if I can learn someone, learn their tells, learn what they are as a person, I can see if I want to play poker with them afterwards as well. Compared to, hey, this player is always going to be, rude to you. It's not going to be a good environment. You can kind of see who wants to, who you want in your circle and who you want to be around to kind of like continue on. Whether I lose a game, win a game, and stuff like that doesn't matter as long as we're having fun. But,
I really
you know,
appreciate that lens, right? I actually described venture capital as essentially poker, right? In the sense that like the key is really what's in the hand, what's in your hand, right? And obviously like entrepreneurs can bluff, right? But
mhm.
also that in a way there's a professionalism around being able to tell, right? So I think those are really important characteristics. I think for me, like I'm not a poker player, but there's definitely excellent poker players in Web3 VC, and a lot of the folks have that kind of skill.
Yeah, because I mean, like everyone has to bluff once in a while, but also if you know someone's playing a true hand, it's kind of like, hey, I know what card you don't know what cards I have, but at the same time, it's just a fun game to kind of have around. And for me, it's like I always wanted to know the backstory of people because what motivates them, what ticks them, because it's kind of like like all you see on media right now and kind of like all of the other interviews is same questions. Hey, what's your company? This and that. But it's like
Sure.
instead of sitting back and be like, how was your day? Like, are you okay today? What's going on? And that's kind of like what I wanted to create. It's just more of a laid back environment to where we can talk about you and childhood, also switching over to let's say like your teenage years. So you're saying you were rebellious because your dad was rebellious coming over to coming over to
Yep.
America. Over there where you were, was it Wisconsin, right?
Yep.
Wisconsin, there wasn't a lot of Asians over there as well. Tell me about that, like growing up in Wisconsin and kind of like being one of the only Asians there, and kind of like how did that affect you in school?
Yeah, so I would say this, right, which is obviously to me around fourth grade, we moved to Michigan. And in a way, that was probably the more striking region. And the reason why that was more striking was that during the 1980s, when I was in kind of high school, like basically the US auto industry was struggling, and it was struggling under the weight of Japan, which is Japanese cars were just at the time, Japanese cars were just better cars, right? And so the US auto industry was really struggling, right? And obviously, a lot of the US auto industry is based in Detroit, Michigan, right? So, in a sense, like, that was the mood. So, in a sense, like, not only was there hostility towards, Asians, but specific hostility towards Japanese people, right? So, in a sense, like, that was kind of like a really interesting kind of environment to grow up in. It definitely was filled with a little bit of like, kind of daily challenges, and so in a way, like it's a place where you learn kind of toughness and independence, you learn to fend for yourself. One of the parts of the immigrant experience is that your parents don't really understand what's happening to you at school, because they don't have any reference point for it. So like, so in a way, you're kind of on your own, and it's kind of like a jungle, right? So survival of the fittest, So it was very Darwinian, but I think I fared reasonably well. I made out okay. One of the things that I remember is funny is from my softball league. So I was in the softball league, and it was a small league. In fact, it was so small that you would play the same teams multiple times in a season, right? Because there weren't enough teams, right? And so we were playing this other team, and what happened was some kid on the other team recognized me, and he was like, "Hey, I remember you. You're the kid that swings really hard but never hits the ball." Right? Which I really like. The thing that was great about that moment for me was that it was so innocent, actually. The thing that was the most striking thing about the moment, because I had experienced a lot of malice, right? So like there's definitely people who are kind of attacking me because of my race and lots of things like that. But this kid was purely innocent, pure innocence, right? This kid was just blurting out whatever the hell was inside of his head, right? And the thing that was so amazing about it was it was true, right? Like that was a moment of clarity where I'm like, that's who I am, right? So I was like, hey, like, good to see you, right? So like in a sense, like at the time, like I didn't actually take offense either, right? Because seriously, like people said a lot more things to me than that, right? So like my skin is super thick, right? So if a kid says something like that to me, I'm just like, is that true? Like, can I benefit from that? And so to me, the thing that's really funny is you can kind of draw a straight line from that to being in VC, right? Which is, in VC, you have to swing for the fences. You have like every single thing you do has to be kind of this grand slam, right? But you're actually allowed to miss, right? You're allowed to kind of like miss. But the only thing that's not forgivable is not swinging for the grand slam. Like, you have to swing really, really hard every time, right? and
Yeah.
and but if you miss, you're in VC, like it's not even three strikes, right? Like VC, like you could just
Yeah, it's
take it,
just
you could take 8 or 9 or 10 strikes, right? But the point is that you really do have to connect, right? You have to kind of get hits. Like it's literally venture capital is literally a hits business, right? So in a sense, like getting getting those hits is really important. That's the heart of the business.
yeah, there was I forgot what movie it is, but there's one where it's like, hey, it's about baseball. It's the same thing. It's like I don't care how many times you swing, but we need to get on base, and that's kind of like how we're gonna
I
start
think you're
scoring.
talking about Moneyball,
Yes, yes, yes,
right?
yes. They
Oakland
looked at
A's,
different averages to make
Billy
sure
Bean.
who. Yep.
Yep, yep. Michael Lewis, great book. Michael Lewis is also writing a book about SBF. And, apparently he was interviewing and following SBF prior to the meltdown. So I think he's going to write an amazing book. But Moneyball, I definitely recommend. Also a great movie with Brad Pitt. But I think that idea that they had was very calculating, right? Which is that they changed and transformed baseball, and it's Oakland A's, right? So it's pretty amazing sports history.
Yeah, it's kind of like th- at that time people were like, this is not going to work. It was like a brand new
Yeah,
type of thing. Where the
for
same thing as
sure.
like blockchain nowadays too. It's like it's a brand new thing. Some of the governments are looking at it. It's like it's a brand new thing. We'll see how it goes. Give it a few years. But now they're starting to kind of like really get into it. And so yeah, so like softball, like kind of like early days, being in softball and everything. Now tell me about kind of like, high school and like early adult areas, like kind of like what did it have a change for you in terms of kind of like the same mentality of, hey, I'm gonna be thick skin, I'm just gonna push through the crowd, or was the environment kind of like starting to shift up a little bit for you?
I definitely felt like being, like I was tough, right? And I feel like I was kind of educated and trained to be tough. My dad was all about kind of being tough. So I feel like that was a good kind of upbringing. I feel like the environment was tough. So like all of those things kind of helped. I did feel like I did loosen up a little bit, after and one of the weird things that happened is that I really gave one of my first public speeches and in high school, and it was funny because I was running for vice president of my class, but I created this insane hack. And what happened was that everyone in my class who was going to ran in a co-president's ticket. And the reason why is that if you look at it mathematically, the game theory is that you want to be your class president and you don't want to be the vice president. So if you're running on a ticket, it's going to be a co-president's ticket, which is technically a vice president and a president running as co-presidents. So what happened was we heard the speeches from those people, and they were all running as co-presidents. And so what I did is I went up to the mic and I said, I'm running as an independent vice presidential candidate for your class. And since there are no other vice presidential candidates, I'm automatically the winner. Thank you very much. And people clapped. Like people were like, and I just got chewed in. Like which is super, it was super ridiculous. Like it was definitely a hack, but it worked. And the thing that was amazing is someone in the administration was probably like, he's
This
kind
kid
of a
thought outside of the
joker,
ball.
but he's also kind of clever. So let's just give it to him, so someone there like agreed with my strategy, and I ended up being vice president of my class, which is kind of ridiculous. And it turned out not to be that interesting or important, but like it was a fun experience for me because I had usually been pretty shy, so that was kind of the first time I had actually kind of stepped up to like a, microphone, and I started kind of, my public speaking endeavors, right? And the thing that's amazing is that was definitely fueled in retrospect by the phenomenon that I described before, which is I had no fear whatsoever of being completely separated and singled out and like, isolated and alone, like none of it. Like I was just like, whatevs, and I think it came across. Like, I think people in the audience were like, what is this? Like, they were, so I got big applause because people were like, wow, like, gutsy guy, right? Like, they just enjoyed hearing me talk, which is fun.
But it's like thinking outside of the ball, it's kind of like, hey, everyone's running for president. No one's running for vice president. Why don't I just partner up with all of them and I'll still have a seat at the table while the rest of them are no longer going to have a seat because only one of them is going to win for it. I'm still
That's
going to
right.
be within those meetings.
It's super hack. Super hack. Yeah, it definitely was amusing. And but I would say that, like, in a way, like, that's kind of like something that I think is really part of a broader trajectory for me, kind of, narratively, which is, I think, to me, like, I think my dad was definitely a strategist. He actually shifted in his career. In Wisconsin, he was an entomologist, which meant that he kind of like was in a bug. He was interested in insects, right? But when he moved to Michigan, he actually became a toxicologist, right? So it's sort of, how do you get rid of agricultural bugs, right? And then when he so he ended up moving to Davis, California, and he became an environmental toxicologist, right? Which is, he flipped over to, how do we get rid of the toxins that are in the environment, right? So to me, like, his sort of strategy game was really interesting because he was definitely someone who sort of like could see ahead, and he was very strong at kind of looking into the future and trying to understand what's going to happen next, right? So I feel like that influence was very strong on me as well, right? Which is, I'm very much thinking constantly as a venture capital person, kind of like, what are the vectors and trends that result in the next kind of Nash equilibrium, right? So I don't know if you watch that show, A Beautiful Mind, but Russell Crowe was playing a mathematician, John Nash, Nobel Prize winning mathematician, who happened to be crazy, right? He was schizophrenic. He lost his mind. But before he lost his mind, he actually developed this theory called the Nash equilibrium, which is a game state where all the players of a game, their best strategy is not to change their strategy, right? So it means that the game is now in a steady state. So the steady state is, okay, everything's working like it's working, right? So the thing that's amazing is, so for example, if you look at Gumi Cryptos Capital, like, if you look at things like our Fund 1 hits, right? For example, like, we led the strategic seed round into OpenSea, right? So like, that represented a shift in a Nash equilibrium where basically there was no really any such thing as like an NFT exchange at that time. But eventually there was this huge thing that met all these unmet needs and hidden needs in the market, right? We also saw stuff like YGG, right? So it's sort of like, YGG is a labor union for the metaverse, or, it's a really strange creature, right? But in a way, it's part of a novel Nash equilibrium, right? So in a sense, like, part of my job is really related to that. And I think I attribute that to my dad, right? Because I really attribute it to his clever thinking about, how, how the world changes, right? And how you can kind of understand all of these disparate vectors, and you can kind of like figure out what's going to happen. So a lot of what I do is I think a lot about what's going to happen in like a 4 to 7 year time frame, which is really the fund life cycle, right? So that's
Mhm.
how quickly funds turn over. And it turns out that the average time to unicorn in Web2 is around 4 years, starting to taper close to 7 years. So it makes sense that the venture cycle is kind of tied to the entrepreneurship cycle.
And it's also kind of like if you look at like Japanese companies too, it's like whenever you're raising in Japan, I guess they don't look at like a 10-year roadmap type of thing. They're looking at, hey, how do I make this last? Like a lot of companies, like, how do I make this last 100 years? What's your 100-year
That's
game plan?
that's one of the genius things that we found. So 100, basically 100% of our LP base in our Fund 1 was Japan, and mostly Japan corporates, right? So they're very, very durable, very long lasting, very kind of futuristic, right? Thinking about 100-year plans, right? Like, if you go back into the history books, one of the amazing mission statements of Sony was to make made in Japan a signifier of quality, not of cheapness, right? So the thing that's shocking when you read those words is that they did it. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, like right now I'm using a Sony camera to talk to you all, right? So like they did it, right? Like if you think about what does made in Japan mean? Like it definitely means quality, right? And the thing that's insane is that when they wrote those words, it clearly did not mean that, right? It meant, wow, like what a piece of junk, right? So like it's when you think about this kind of long lasting, durable vision, that's been kind of one of the things that's fueled our family of funds, right? Which is that, all of our fund one LPs essentially doubled down into our fund two, because they just have this long lasting, durable vision, and they really kind of have this sort of professionalism, right? So the stability has been incredibly powerful, right? Because when you look at kind of these optimal models, you really do want kind of a very stable base, right? So that you can kind of go out to the edge and take, and do risk and deploy risk, right? So to me, that's the kind of perfect mix. I think having an unstable base is kind of like undesirable.
It's
By the
mixing kind of
way,
like maintaining the risk level to the capital level, right? Just making sure that the risk to reward and also the balance structure is there.
agree. And by the way, for those of you who don't have the kind of Japanese etymology, one of the cool hacks is that when you deconstruct the name Satoshi Nakamoto in Japanese, right? Satoshi basically can be interpreted to mean like a brilliant light or a bright light, right? And then Nakamoto basically means, so moto means base, right? Naka means inside, right? So it means a bright light inside the base, right? Which is kind of like a shockingly interesting name for someone who has like ignited this Bitcoin revolution. So I just think, it's interesting. And, I was thinking about this from the perspective of finance, right? Which is that, you know, in a sense, when we were talking about this idea of a stable base, right? That's such a foundational idea in finance that, in fact, it's printed on the back of the dollar. When you look at the Illuminati pyramid, right? You basically have like the pyramid is the entire structure is based on longevity and it's based on kind of like stability, right? That's the idea. But that the triangular shape is also kind of like it implies kind of this vector of both control, right? And obviously the eye represents kind of the visibility from the top, right? So it's sort of
Hmm.
it's a very interesting form. But I just really wanted to muse about that, right? So I think from our perspective, like, we just think that there is this long lasting thing and then there are shorter lasting things, right? And, the idea of a series of funds is the long lasting thing. The fund itself is a shorter lasting thing. And what's even lasting shorter is runway, right? Is entrepreneur runway. So we have to think about what will happen during the runway and we have to think about what will happen during the fund life cycle, and then we have to think about what happens in between funds and, in the long run, ultimately.
Now we just went through to all the way up to teenage Miko. Now, kind of like from that portion on. Now you said you went to college, and so your dad went from learning about bugs to learning how to kill bugs to learning how to kill bugs in a huge area. So kind of like
Well,
the
and how to clean up after you kill bugs, right? Like that's
yeah.
the environmental part.
Yeah. So tell me the evolution of Miko after kind of like the early years of kind of like breaking out on your own and going to college and starting to be on your own and actually meeting a lot of people. Did you meet a lot of Asians in college, or kind of like was it still within that area to where you're still the anomaly within the region?
It definitely, I continued to sort of be the anomaly, and it's very, to the point where I became kind of like what in Asia is sort of called a banana, right? Which is sort of like Uh, no, it's not a banana. It's actually the reverse, right? Which is sort of
Uh,
like a yellow on the outside. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like it is a banana,
Twinkie.
right? Yellow on the outside,
Yeah.
yeah, white on the inside, or a Twinkie, right? Either one, right? So in a sense, like I felt comfortable with that. So I really kind of didn't seek out or cultivate, specifically friends who were Asian. So like, I think that kind of became part of what got baked in. But I think in terms of kind of like the subsequent years, like I definitely moved into the field of academic neuroscience, and I really started studying uh, computational neural networks. So recently Professor Hinton, who I studied in graduate school, just left Google, and I think he got a little bit famous because he was talking about kind of like AI and the kind of threats of AI, right? That AI could like take over the world, this kind of stuff. So he got into the news. But like in graduate school, I definitely studied deep learning, connectionist systems, abstract neural networks, kind of like back propagation style networks, and like, really developing kind of computerized models of learning systems in the brain. So that was kind of my cup of tea at the time.
So for that portion, like you said, neural systems of the brain. So kind of like, are you talking about like pathways, or are you talking about more of like
Yeah, so really the program I was in is more of a holistic program, right? So in the holistic program, we studied all kinds of like, biological models and systems, like Aplysia californica, the sea slug, right? Monkey systems, all kinds of like different animal-based systems and models, right? But we also did, everything from electrophysiology, patch clamping individual neurons, right? Doing kind of more complex biochemical research, and then of course computational, right? Computational modeling, which is kind of the stuff that I got the most excited about because I definitely have been sort of a computer nerd, since a young age. I mean, I think, one of the things that's kind of inseparable from my childhood is that like, I kind of retreated into the computer, right? Because I think the thing that happens is that the world of the computer is a world that's fair and orderly and it's logical. And, obviously, if your world outside is kind of chaotic, then the best place to go seek order, right? The thing that's really amazing is it's also an incredibly constructive environment. So it basically means that if anything is kind of going wrong, it's probably your fault, and you should probably make your software better, right? So I definitely got obsessed with kind of like building better software, right? So I think that to me, like that part of my youth kind of came up in graduate school when I started thinking about how to build better software, right? And I
I
started working. Most of my neural networks were C and C++. So, you know, I definitely got exposed to kind of very, very complex software.
I remember when I was like 13 or so, we just got a computer and everything, and like this is like my second computer, but I always wanted it to like learn what was like how does this work? So I one day I literally sat down and I took apart everything, like all the screws,
That's
literally
great.
all the items. I found out that you were supposed to unplug it afterwards after I touched it. So it shocked me and everything, just
Wow.
trial and error. Got
Wow.
shocked, took everything out, and then the thing about that was like I forgot where everything was and how to put it all back in. So I'm kind of
That's
like tinkering
amazing.
for hours. It was literally like 2 days later. My mom looks at me and she's like, "This thing's still not placed together. Like we just purchased this. Like you just broke it apart." And finally, I was like, you know what? Why don't I just go to the library? We had a public library that was pretty close to the house, and I went in there and I got out a book that says how to put, basically learn more about computer parts, and that's how I kind of placed the computer back together. And with like
That's
every screw and
amazing.
everything, it was kind of like reaching out for resources because I mean I couldn't get on the internet to learn about how to put the computer back together. The computer's already taken apart, so just kind of like
I
it took a while, but she was pissed for a little bit.
So what I got obsessed with is better software, and I think that really bridges over into what I did next, which is, when I left graduate school, I ended up actually working very briefly at Wired magazine in this division called Hotwired, which was sort of the internet division. We did a lot of funky things there, like for example, we invented the banner ad, right? So sorry about that. Actually, it's probably a mistake at the time, but this was in 1993, 94, and we basically. But what happened there for me is I actually, in my quest for better software, I ran across the Java programming language, and I eventually joined Sun Microsystems, the creator of Java, because I really became like an enthusiast. So so at that point I became sort of I moved from the application and software development side over to the kind of developer relations side. So I really started focusing on Devrel. So that's kind of where my background is really in developer evangelism. So that was where I got my start in Silicon Valley. So that was when I landed up here.
So that's when you were starting to switch over to Silicon Valley and everything. Now, how did that lead you into kind of like the venture capital side then? If you were kind of like going more towards the DevRel side.
Yeah, yeah. So Devrel basically eventually leads to marketing. So I became kind of a marketing person, and I was working on developer tools and open source software, right? So one of the crazy things that happened to me is I got super interested in sort of revenue automation systems, CRM, like full stack automation. So there's a bunch of tools like Marketo, HubSpot, Pardot, Salesforce.com, like all these different kinds of like full stack automation tools, right? And it turns out that that's almost like the new ERP system. Like it's the new way to kind of like install enterprise software. And it's the new way to get startups who have achieved product market fit to kind of hyperscale revenue growth, right? And so I got really interested in that. But what ended up happening that was very weird was I mutated from doing that to basically being a fractional CMO for hire. Because what happened was that I became efficient at it. So what I would do is I would join a company and then I would install this and then I would basically raise money and we would triple the valuation of the company, right? But that it turned out that my sweet spot was kind of right between seed and series A, right? So I started doing this serially. And the weird thing that happened was I got better at it. And so I got fast enough where I could do it in less than a year. And as soon as you become less than a year, the 1 year vesting cliff stops making sense, right? And so the thing that I started doing was fractional CMO, where I started with no cliff vesting immediately. And what I ended up after a while, I ended up with a bunch of companies which were in my portfolio because I was vesting, I had equity in these companies. But the thing that was so weird was that they were a random grab bag of companies that needed my services, right? And so when I analyzed my portfolio, I was like, why do I own all these things? Like, I don't have that much conviction in them. They're maybe not the best companies, And so that eventually mutated. I think the inflection point for me was really when it came to the point of kind of this Bitcoin white paper thing, right? So, when Bitcoin hit really hard, and obviously it was a few years after that, but it started really percolating through Silicon Valley and becoming a force, right? So for me, jumping from open source kind of on the entrepreneurship side over to the venture side, it really just became that, my company is actually originally was based in Japan, but wanted to migrate into Silicon Valley, right? And so they were really looking for a partner. And, I basically got sort of pitched on, actually, the original pitch was, can you help us find a partner for this firm? And eventually my conclusion was that I would be a good fit, right? That I'm a person of Japanese origin. I understand the Japanese language, culture. I have a Japanese face and last name, so I can definitely like hang, but at the same time, I can help this firm kind of navigate Silicon Valley culture, US culture, right? So like, I felt like, oh, that's a good fit for me. So I ended up kind of like jumping on board, and I think our fund 1 was like, in a way it benefited because I had done 25 years of entrepreneurship prior. And then, I'm in my like maybe 50th year of doing venture, right? So in a sense, the majority of my career is sort of entrepreneurship, minority investor. So like, in a sense, like I'm very like builder centric and I'm very sort of like, I would say entrepreneur oriented.
So for like you would kind of go into some of these companies, and after a while, you're like, you know what, my value is actually going to be worth more than just helping them build for value. So might as well, partner into my own. But kind of like so for that portion, now you're like kind of like starting out your companies and everything. Looking back at your childhood, it's like, does some of that things that were like, what are some of the things that you wish you would have known then that you know now? So that, leading up to the journey of you starting your companies and everything, you kind of have it, use it as a cheat code, by the way.
Yeah, I feel like this, right? Which is, I feel like there's really the easy way and the hard way, and in a sense, a lot of the things I learned were kind of the hard way, which I think is fine, right? I don't have a problem with learning things the hard way. Like, for example, when I left Sun Microsystems, I joined a startup, and the startup actually had run out of cash. So, like, they promised me a big title with a big salary, and they promised me the moon, and like, I ended up raising it took me 9 months with no pay to raise their money. I raised like 5.25 million, in Silicon Valley. But the thing that was fascinating about that was that was a trial by fire. I learned a lot, and I learned stuff that I still apply today, right? So in a sense, like I feel like the School of Hard Knocks is a perfectly good school. Obviously there's other academic schools that are good, but like I would say that like I don't really have regrets about this very circuitous route. Part of my mental model is that I like this idea of windows, not the operating system, but I like the idea of looking through different windows, right? So if you look into a house and you look through different windows, you get different impressions, right? So to me, like having a really winding career has actually been beneficial for me because I just feel like I can look at the world from a bunch of different perspectives, and I think that those perspectives inform how I think and understand the world, right? So I just feel like that's, so I in terms of like, if I had a time machine and I could go back in time and tell myself something, I probably would have told myself not to sell the Apple stock that I owned, that I bought. I bought it like after Steve Jobs left, and before he came back, right? So like, and then I sold it, right? But to me, like losing on that proposition was fine, right? Because the point is this: is when you look back on that, I learned a very valuable lesson, right? Which is I learned a very valuable lesson about thesis investing, which is my thesis when I invested is Apple is an incredibly iconic brand with incredible history, and they make wonderful products and they're not going anywhere. So they're going to still be here in like 50 years and they're going to be even bigger. That was my thesis. And guess what? I panic sold. Right? Because it went down further and I was like, oh my God. And I sold it. Right. So what did I learn? I learned if your thesis isn't broken, don't sell. Right. Which is like,
if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. That's what I kind of like go by too. It's like
so I guess what I'm arguing is this is if I had a time machine and I told myself not to sell the Apple stock, I would be richer, but I would also be dumber. Right. And so then I would be making foolish choices now. Right. So my point is really that I feel like the School of Hard Knocks is a perfectly good school. They don't really give you a certificate or a degree, but like, but you come away with valuable lessons, right? So in a sense, like the cheat code isn't really that much of a thing in my worldview, right? But I think that story, but your question is funny because it did turn up an interesting story, right? Which I really shouldn't have sold that stock from a numerical perspective, buy low, sell high perspective.
My uncle, I think it was 2010 or 2011. Bitcoin was like under $1 or so. I remember him kind of like I remember going to his house and kind of like seeing his computer always on, and I was like, why is it always on? He's like, I'm doing stuff, don't worry about it. Years later, like I think it was like 2 years ago when I finally found out that he was mining Bitcoin back in like 2010, 2011. And he had two computers. So the first one, basically, this was like, it wasn't worth anything in terms of like the price at that time. And he was like, I'm mining and then I'm just selling Bitcoin to kind of pay off my tuition in college.
Amazing.
So he was going to college, getting it paid off by just mining Bitcoin at home. And then the second one was, but this is like Bitcoin was under $1. So he was like, I sold so much to pay college tuition. The second one was, he was like, I had a moon bag, Amazing. Right? You place it into a second hard drive. It was on a laptop. And to this day, he can't find that laptop. And he was like, I don't remember. It was like 10,000 Bitcoin or so. And I was like, wait, what? Like, what? He's like, I know it's over 1,000 for sure. Because like, I would always keep that on there regardless. And to this day, whenever I told him I was like, Bitcoin's at 20,000. He's like, what? Where's my laptop? Where's my?
Yeah, I mean, it's to me the thing that's so like, just as a closing note, like I've been thinking a lot about where to place your hopes, right? And I feel like, to me, like it feels like the right thing to place your hopes in your ability to work and your ability to care, right? Because in a sense, like ultimately those are the engines through which you create and derive meaning, right? And so in a sense, like, if you're able to create and derive continued meaning, then in a sense, like your bank balance is a number that can go up or down, but as long as you're able to care and you're able to produce work, then you can create meaning. right? So like, as long as you could do all of those things, it feels like you probably can, be comfortable and live whatever life, fortune has given you.
And I think it's kind of like as long as you can provide value, right? Because like a lot of people do get lucky in crypto. A lot of people do make a lot of money or lose a lot of money in crypto. But it's like as long as you continue on with the wave and be able to provide value, there's going to be, you're constantly always going to be making money. But it's just a monetary form of value. That's just an exchange for time, right?
Yeah, yeah. I like to construe my venture business as we want people to convert the money that we provide into software that other people want to use, right? So, in a sense, like that's the mental model. It's a very positive sum model and it's a very win win model, right? So, the only thing we really want is we want win win. And if we can't get that, then we'll take lose lose, right? We don't do win lose. We don't do lose win. Like we really only look for, that kind of relationship where we're, we Gumi Cryptos has a slogan on our website, which is, your passion, our conviction, right? So we definitely want to find those sort of Olympian level startup entrepreneurs, and we just want to back them to the hilt.
Yeah. And kind of like with sorry, with like kind of like the whole adventure so far, for the people that are listening in and kind of like watching this as well, what would you want to kind of give them as a piece of advice for them? Whether
I
it's a
would say
quote
that
or kind of
this
like a
is, to me, the most important thing is to find your passion, really, is to find kind of like both your talent and your passion, right? Because passion really relates to your willingness and ability to suffer, right? So, like, you have to find something that you care about so much that you're willing to suffer, right? Because that will be the thing that you can create your future, right? Like, so to me, like, that's, and obviously there's many different levels of it, but I think in our business, like in the venture business, it has to be pretty huge, right? Like your passion has to be huge because, and obviously to me, everyone has to have some passion, right? Because like, it's just different doses, right? But in the venture world, we're looking for the really intense burning passion.
no, it's kind of like birthing a child, especially when you're creating a company, right? It's your baby. You want to make sure that
It's
it's
hard.
fine. It
It's
is
definitely hard. It's a hard thing to do, and we have a lot of respect for entrepreneurs, and we're just looking for the really, really passionate ones with that have really strong purpose, meaning, and are out to kind of change the world.
So yeah, I kind of wanted to end it off on there, and thank you for taking the time out today to give us a lot of these insights. So this is from childhood all the way up to kind of like where you are now today. But thanks for letting us kind of like peek into the window of Miko, right? To learn a little bit more about you, a little bit more about your philosophies and your values, and kind of like be able to see what makes you tick and what makes you how you're strong today and what
I
drives you.
love that. And I'm definitely all about better software. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Miko Java, Mikojava. It's
That's where the
my
Java comes
very
from.
original, handle, and it's still going. So, you can engage me there. I do reply to, if you tweet me out, I'll definitely engage you. So happy to have a chat there too.
That's where the Java was coming from because I was like Miko Java. I was like, why is it Java?
That's right.
but uh,
Thanks so much.
but thanks, Miko. And for the ones that are tuning in, we'll also have the information down below for you guys in the description as well.